Welcome to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. Martin Nisenholtz is a true digital media pioneer. He founded perhaps the first digital marketing group at Ogilvie Mather, all the way back in 1983. But from 1995 through 2012, he was first the president of New York Times Electronic Media, and then the CEO of New York Times Digital, and then the Senior Vice President of Digital Operations at the New York Times Company. Martin is literally the guy who has been front and center in everything the Times has been doing in digital for the last 20 years. He headed the team that launched the first nytimes.com website back in 1995, and he has helped steer all of the Times' web and digital efforts all the way through to the present social and mobile era. Please note, we discuss several times in this conversation a great oral history resource that Martin himself has been a part of in his role as a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. You can find this oral history project at digitalriptide.org. It's a fabulous resource, some 80-odd interviews, including some people we've spoken to on the show and plenty that we haven't yet had the pleasure to get to. So do check that out, digitalriptide.org, and please enjoy this conversation with Martin Nisenholtz about the New York Times in the web era. Martin Nisenholtz, thanks for coming on the Internet History Podcast.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
We do kind of like to start off with a little bit of background, and so in your case, I want to go back to when you're in college in the late 70s and early 80s, when you first encounter digital media, and specifically in the form of teletext. Could you give me the story of how you first encountered teletext and started working with it?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, a PhD student at the Annenberg School in 1979 when I got an offer to work on a project at what was then called the NYU Alternate Media Center. That later kind of morphed into the Interactive Telecommunications Program, ITP, which is a very prominent graduate program now in interactive media. But back then, a woman named Red Burns had started Alternate Media Center to do research on what was then new media. Actually, in her era, it was the early era. It was cable access, and then it started to morph into interactive media in the late 70s. The British had invented a technology called CFAX, which was a teletext technology, and a companion technology called Prestel, which was a videotext technology in the mid-70s. And they had actually implemented CFAX, I think, at the BBC. And the National Science Foundation took a look at this and realized that it could be material in terms of information transmission, and so funded a project at WETA, which was the public broadcast station in Washington, along with the Washington Post as the principal information provider, to implement a teletext trial, a test of teletext in the United States, again in the late 70s in 1979. And so I left the University of Pennsylvania essentially for a one-year project, and then never went back because I just sort of fell in love with New York and the center, and I started teaching as well at NYU, in 1980. So never got my PhD, but began to learn a lot about interactive media. Initially teletext.
Well, for the context, Could you describe what teletext actually was? It was not computers. It was more the idea that because personal computers in the early 80s hadn't really gone mainstream, hadn't penetrated people's homes, and so the idea was
the IBM PC hadn't been invented yet.
Right,
so
exactly. So
they were, obviously I began working on an Apple II at NYU in essence as a way to simulate what a teletext page might look like. But teletext, very simply, really simply, for the most part, there were no PCs. I mean, not anything approaching a mass market for personal computers. And so everyone had a television, right? And so a teletext decoder, which plugged into the television, think of it almost as a kind of slideshow in the sky, where with a keypad you basically select one of the slides as it goes by, right? So, I want the weather. It's slide 50. I type 50 into the keypad, and lo and behold, the weather appears, in text form with a few crude graphics on my television set. So it's a way to transmit information over the air into the vertical blanking interval of a broadcast signal, an analog broadcast signal. So that was the initial idea. Now, videotext, which was a much more complex and interesting technology, actually was a bridge between the telephone network and the television. Again, no PCs, so everyone had a television, everyone had a telephone, so if you just put this decoder in between them, in essence, you could provide everyone with interactivity, for fairly simply. And videotext, because it was two-way, because it was plugged into the telephone network, allowed you to do a whole lot more. So those were the two technologies at the time, which turned into evolutionary dead ends with the growth of the personal computer.
Right. As regular listeners to this podcast know, I bang on a lot about how this popular notion that print and legacy media and newspapers were caught flat-footed by digital technology is completely not true. I mean, there's a whole series of experiments that we've talked about, like the Cube service, the Viewtron service, all these things that are in the early 80s even that companies are experimenting with.
Yeah, actually the early 80s. As I say, I mean, we started working on the broadcast teletext trial at WETA, which involved the Washington Post in 1979. So the trial went live in 1980. And videotext was pretty much over by 1986. So all of these activities, which by the way, involved investments of tens of millions of dollars in each place that they were implemented, were all over by the mid-1980s. And so, you're absolutely right. I mean, all of these newspaper companies were very, very well aware that classified advertising could be materially at risk over time, and we're investing heavily early on to try to figure that out. And there are all sorts of reasons why, and we can go into why they may not have succeeded or didn't.
Yes, I'd very much just briefly because you think of it now. Well, obviously the PC is going to come along and the internet's going to come along and take this over. But that at the time that wasn't obvious. So, in your mind, why did video text and things like that not really take off in the 80s?
Well, the most amazing findings at Viewtron, which was Knight Ritter's trial, and Knight Ritter, by the way, which later sold itself to McClatchy as I think in 2006, and so went out of business. Although its newspapers continued to operate under McClatchy, he discovered very early on that users wanted communication out of interactivity. They basically did not. I mean, reading text on the screen was something they do, but not certainly very much, and all of the time spent online was spent in social media, or what we today call social media, whether it was email or bulletin boards, forums, things like that. And every service that was up by 1982 or 83, most people knew that the principal use of interactive media was going to be in communications. That's what Steve Case discovered, pretty early on and ran with, and that's why I think AOL did so well, but that was one reason why AOL did so well, or America Online back then. But the fact is that the newspapers knew that by 1983, 84, something like that. And
if they know that, why didn't they act on that? If they
because
have that
they
data?
weren't in that business. I mean, their view was, they concluded by 1985 or 86 that the thing wasn't really being used to read a newspaper, and therefore they weren't very much interested in it because they weren't in the business of social media. Now, looking back, 30 years, you can say that was incredibly stupid. They could have been America Online very easily. They knew what the basic consumer drivers were, but they weren't in that business, and so they moved on. They shut it down.
For you personally, in the midst of this, you end up at Ogilvie Mather, the advertising firm, and you start an interactive advertising group there. Was it specifically to target this, supposed future of teletext and video text and things like that?
Yeah, I was developing product for the WETA trial. I was one of a handful of people in the country who knew what teletext was at that point, and it's come full circle. Now I'm among a handful of people who know what teletext is 35 years later. But in any event, at that point, Jerry Levin, who had played a material role in inventing HBO and was running Time Inc. by then, wanted to, deploy teletext in a full 6 megahertz cable channel. So tons and tons. Think of the world's biggest slideshow, if you extend the metaphor. And he went to Ogilvie because Ogilvie was the agency, I believe, for Sports Illustrated and Time Magazine, or two of the big Time Inc. magazines. And he said, look, this is going to be advertiser supported. You guys need to understand this. And a creative director named Jerry McGee found me in Washington. I had, in addition to working on WETA, I realized very early on that in order for this to work, we needed to get artists and writers and animators and people like that involved. So I wrote a grant to the National Endowment for the Arts, which was matched by the Department of Communication in Canada, and began to put artists online, including Keith Haring, by the way. It was the only, I think, digital art that he ever did. He did for this project.
Does that still exist anywhere that we can see?
I have slides, but I don't have the discs. Disappeared into Ogilvie somewhere, and they were the old 8-inch floppy disks that played in this technology it was actually imported from Canada, called Teledon, on an old DEC machine. It was a mini computer actually, and so it used big floppies.
Boy, if you could resurrect even the slides or something, I bet that would be of great interest to a lot of people.
Well, I have a slide. I mean, I can maybe get a C print made of the slide and send it to it. I'm not sure who does that these days, but anyway, so that exhibit was going on in Washington, and so McGee somehow through one of his people discovered me there and brought me in and said, we've got this job. Can you help? I said, of course, I'm happy to do that. And so I was still working for New York University, and I began to consult for Ogilvie. And about 6 months later, the agency came to me and said, we think this is important. Do you think you would want to come work for us? I said, well, only if I can start my own agency. And they sort of looked at me like I was a little crazy because, there were no interactive agencies then. Certainly not. There were may have been one or two kind of job shops that were out there working for, I don't know if working for who, but this was the first creative development agency in a large, advertising agency in the world. And so we started Ogilvie Interactive, which at that time was called the Interactive Marketing Group, but ultimately became Ogilvie Interactive, in March of 1983. And I hired two people. One, the designer from the teletext trial in Washington, which had ended, a guy named Bill Norton, and the second person was a woman from Florida, who was going to be my, kind of my account person. So the three of us started Ogilvie Interactive in March of '83.
And so over the next decade or so, does that evolve into experiments with other digital media things like, for example, the online services, CompuServe, AOL, that sort, or specifically Prodigy, which as listeners know, launched from day one with ads and things like that?
Yeah, that's right. So Prodigy, I think it's a bit of a myth that Wired created the first banner ad, because Prodigy, obviously he created the first banner ad on the web,
right?
Because the web didn't exist when Prodigy was first started, but Prodigy was doing banner ads well before.
Right at the bottom of every single screen that loaded.
Yeah. They're you can blame them or not blame them, but they were. But a lot of the work we were doing. Remember, Compaq had by I think by '86 or '87, maybe even before that, had a pretty luggable machine, and we were starting to do Salesforce automation projects. We started to get much more into, programming than just simply, the creation of graphical elements and, sort of presentation modules for videotext services, because videotext ended by '86, and at that point we started to work on other online services, including Prodigy and America Online, but also we were doing a lot of work for public, for kiosks and other public location media, including automated teller machines, which were at that time pretty crude. So all of that stuff was fair game in the mid 1980s.
So how do you get involved at the New York Times? I believe you joined them in 1995.
Correct.
Go ahead. Tell me the story how you get involved there.
Well, the story is that I wanted to develop a much more robust engineering capability than Ogilvie was interested in doing in 1994. And I had a job offer at Ameritech, which was a Baby Bell in Chicago. And at that time, they were, they had deregulated the phone companies, and they were building a cable system in Chicago, and it was a very advanced cable system. And so one of the projects that we had been working on at Ogilvie was AT&T's joint venture with Viacom in Cerritos, California, where we were developing, video-on-demand services and other very early versions of interactive television, what today you would call regular television, but back then, because you could select a movie and play games and stuff like that, it was called interactive television. Anyway, that's exactly what Ameritech wanted to build at scale in Chicago, and so they hired me to program this system. And I realized when I got there that I really didn't like working in the confines of a big telephone company, but it wasn't terrible or anything like that. I was fine. But when the New York Times called to say that they wanted to start an interactive division, it was pretty intriguing for me because I missed New York. I had always absolutely loved the New York Times from the time I was, a college student. I was reading it. So I leaped at the opportunity to be, the founder of the Times' online division. So I joined the Times in mid 1995 to lead the team that started the website.
Well, but when you get hired, it's not necessarily to start a website, right? It's just to do whatever they're going to do in digital, right?
No, I think that it was clear that by then we needed to start a website. There was a kind of crude AOL service called Acthines, which I really hated.
Right, which Rich Meislin has already provided us with screenshots, which I've shared before, but I'll put in the show notes as well.
Yeah, so Rich had been working from the newsroom side to convince the paper that we really needed to do something much more aggressive. And Rich is a very close friend of mine. He's somebody who, was instrumental in helping us, get this thing started. But and then later became for me as editor of the website. So, but well before that, there were folks at the Times developing prototypes, and so when I got there, it was pretty clear that we wanted to develop a website. I had a very different vision of what the website should be coming in cold. I mean, my view was that, my reference point coming in was Yahoo, and I felt pretty strongly that the Times could develop that kind of service, without too much trouble. And
in terms of being a guide to the web,
yeah, I felt like at that time I really felt like, a guide to the web was what the Times. I didn't like the idea at the time of repurposing the New York Times on the web. I just didn't like that idea. I told Arthur that. I said, that there wasn't really going to be much demand for reading the paper on the screen. You've got to go back and think about how slow the bandwidth was at that point and how crude the monitors were. It was very, very hard to read a screen and download information at that point.
Very low resolution.
So I felt like Yahoo was very well optimized for, speed and currency. And I just thought that a Times branded version of that, with editors, really picking the best stuff out of the internet, would be a very good idea. And so, but I realized very quickly that that's not what the folks at the Times wanted to do, and so we set about creating the best website that we could that reflected the journalism of the New York Times. And I think in retrospect, they were right and I was wrong. I don't think that I think let me put it this way. Let me give myself a little bit more credit than that.
Sure.
I think if we had executed properly, we would have been able to build something much more meaningful than a newspaper website. Okay, but I think getting from where we were as a culture to doing that was an unrealistic expectation on my part. In fact, a quite insane expectation. And so I think we did exactly the right thing at the end, which was to leverage the journalism of the New York Times. But the seminal moment was in mid-1995 when I joined, and I remember saying that, okay, we can put this website up, but we really need to build an engineering team to experiment with something more interesting. And at that time, the company's CFO, just wouldn't fund it.
Let me interrupt for a second, because I'm glad you brought that up, because I want to get into some of the nitty gritty here. So when you do come on board and all right, we're gonna put the New York Times on the web, where does the engineering and software talent come from? Is it internal at the New York Times? Did you have to hire outside people? How did you put your team together?
Well, there was a fellow named Steve Luciani who had been working. He was one of the folks helping to prototype, and he was a technical guy. And he came from inside, and he hired a guy named Ben, I think as a freelancer initially, and the two of them, we're not talking about rocket science here. The two of them, in essence, created this prototype, and from there we just built, we built a fairly rudimentary website to begin with.
Right. Actually, let me step in again for the nitty gritty. This is way before the era of CMS's content management systems.
Oh, yeah.
So are you guys just literally hard coding HTML, just throwing it up? Explain to me that process.
Well, yeah. The homepage of the New York Times for a fairly long time was actually a GIF. It was a hand-coded graphical image, and the reason that we did that was because we felt that we really felt that the Times had a certain look and feel, a Timesian look and feel, and I think that was one of the things that we did right, and I think that was part of what Rich helped bring to the table, which was a real design sensibility. And even guys like Steve Jobs were very respectful of that, which is why, a few years later I ended up on the stage with him to do the iPad. But that notion of graphical integrity was very important. So I frankly don't remember when the first CMS was implemented.
Well, you guys might have just hacked it together yourselves, just as needs be, I suppose.
Yeah, at the very beginning, but not too long after that, and it might even have been roughly around the launch. A couple of CMSs came into being. I mean, I just don't remember the dates, unfortunately.
No problem. One other nitty-gritty question.
Do that research. I mean, and you could probably ask Rich. He might know. He might remember.
Okay. One other nitty-gritty question, which would be easier to remember possibly, is what was the editorial flow like? So when you launch, are you essentially launching, I guess, the morning edition like once a day? Do the stories go to the print editors first, and then you guys get it at the end, at the very last, or how does it, when it launches? What is that editorial flow like?
Well, there was a big fight initially because another part of the company had been licensing the product to third parties. So as I recall, there were two kinds of licenses. There were licenses for archival purposes to companies like LexisNexis. And then there was a so-called 24-hour product that was licensed, I believe, to Dow Jones News Retrieval, of all people. That division essentially went to war with us and said, if you guys put this stuff up on the web, you're going to cannibalize our business. And there was a moment, and, Rich will remember that, others will remember it. There was a moment when I wasn't sure we were going to be able to do it. Actually, Arthur Sulzberger had to petition his father to actually allow us to do that, and he successfully did that. And so Arthur managed to push it through, but there was a compromise where we were only allowed to publish a set number of stories, and we had to wait until the file went to Dow Jones. We couldn't publish before them. And so we could publish X number of stories by midnight, and then Y number of stories by 6 a.m. It was crazy. And that was all to keep, that was all in a compromise with this other division of the company that was fighting to keep its customers happy. Hard to believe today, I know. Now, and we didn't win any rights on the archival side. So, one of my huge, and I've said this publicly many times, one of my huge, it's not so much, I'm not sure what I could have done about it, but regrets is that, we had the largest news archive in the world. And it was clear to me, I had been working in this area already for 15 years, right? So I knew a lot about the way people used interactive services. And search was like a main thing, right? That's what they did. So, that's what, in part that's what, Yahoo was based on. So, I wanted to create a really great search engine at the Times, and we weren't allowed to do that because, LexisNexis, they didn't want to interfere with that relationship, with the news archive.
Let me interrupt one last time, because I want to move on to one thing, but you made me think of something. I'm super curious about when culturally, this is definitely jumping ahead, the New York Times online division moved to like the real-time news thing. Obviously, that probably wasn't early on. Do you have any memory of that? Like, in the sense that
we wanted to do that from the beginning.
Okay.
We all were watching Yahoo News. Reuters had licensed itself. Reuters owned a small piece of Yahoo, and
right.
I was watching Reuters implement, a really fast. ASCII text, and narrowband communications go hand in hand, right? So, I was watching Reuters, which is a wire service, continually update itself on Yahoo, and I was very, very anxious to do something. And so, fairly early on, we managed to start to get access to the AP, and I think that was the initial the initial continuous news.
So
but the Times never.
You recognized very early on that it is going to be, as soon as news happens, it's got to be up there online as soon as we can.
No, that the AP did that.
Okay.
Wire service
Right.
did that. The New York Times didn't do that. The New York Times was on the 24-hour cycle.
Right. Well, that's what I'm trying to determine.
Okay. So, the folks at the Interactive Division knew that was important, and so
that's what I'm saying. Yes.
Yeah. So what happened is we actually roughly 1998, maybe 99, but we acquired equity in the Street.com, and the Street, as a financial news site, was running a very heavily updated, quick news service, and so. At that point, we sent a couple of editors down there to learn how to do it, and they came back and started the continuous news desk. It was called the CND, the continuous news desk, which evolved, obviously over time into, real time, not real time, but the updated news service. So, but that was a little later on. I mean, we launched the full website. We launched a kind of a practice site where we were exercising the publishing system I believe in October of 95 during that Pope's visit.
I was going to say it was the Pope was visiting, I think.
Yeah, and then we shut it down, and then the full website came up in January of 96. And so I'd say continuous news, it took us another 3 years probably to convince the company that we really needed to do continuous news. But in the interim, we were doing, we were working with the AP.
Yeah, I'm asking a lot of people when that cultural shift happened to the continuous news. But switching gears back to the launch, you launch free. It's not a paywall, but you do have to register, so it's ad-supported. I have to imagine that there had to be conversations about a subscription service or something like that.
Yeah, there were.
Okay, go ahead.
I mean, it's my fault. I take complete responsibility for it. When I walked into the company, there were 3 business models, and all of them were based on a very limited amount of content. It was like 20 stories a day for $9.95, $14.95, and $19.95. Those were the 3 price points per month. And I said, "This is insane. We're never going to be able to scale this business and actually create habit around it, create loyal usage around it." I mean, I said, at some point we absolutely are going to want to charge for this, but it's going to be, in the future when the product is ready, when the product is ready to be paid for. Right now, it sucks, and also, you can't. You're up against CNN. You're up against. This wasn't a newspaper business; it was a website. So we were up against Yahoo News, CNN, MSNBC was launching,
Pathfinder,
all these really good news services.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, there were newspapers out there that were doing a good job, like the Nando people, which was the News and Observer in Raleigh,
and the Mercury Center.
The Mercury Center was very good, and the Washington Post had launched something. Boston had launched Boston.com. So, it was like there was a crap load of competition on the web back then. So, just because we were the New York Times and we're going to put 20 stories up didn't mean anything. It didn't mean. So I basically, and my team was very, very solidly behind me on this. I mean, everybody who knew anything about the environment at that point knew that we needed to launch this way. Now, it's true, the Journal had always wanted to charge, but my view of that was that the Journal had to charge because they were very concerned about cannibalization of the print product. And we just had a fundamentally different value proposition. And, as it turns out, I mean, you fast forward a couple of decades, and we have more paying subscribers now than the Wall Street Journal. So, I'm just saying, this notion that the genie couldn't be put back in the bottle and all this other nonsense turned out to be just untrue.
You say that your team was completely engaged. I'm curious about the institutional support from management, but also maybe the support from, editorial and other places at the times. Like, so when you launch, what is the institutional support? What is the thinking inside the company about what you're doing?
Well, look, I think that there were folks who felt that, putting the Times up on the web for free was probably not the right decision. But management was very supportive of our vision. They were very supportive of the fact that we needed to build an audience in order to get, an advertising business started, which we did. And remember, I did two things that I think helped. One was to charge internationally, which was really just an experiment. I mean, there was no New York Times available internationally, so I thought, well, geez, let's see whether we can, get some subscribers international. So we charged for international usage. But much, much more importantly, I had realized from having worked at Ogilvie for all those years that the data was going to be really important. And so having a kind of opt-in permission marketing scheme, which to be fair, Wired had already tried and failed at, right? They tried registration and brought it down pretty quickly because people just refused to sign up. I felt that the Times had a strong enough brand to attract users in that way, and in fact, that was right. And we started to develop a very good database. So we had email contacts, we had demographic data on our users, and obviously this is decades before, highly sophisticated ad tech. So, the fact that we could go to market with some level of targeting and some knowledge of who our users were and what they wanted was really valuable to advertisers. And so the advertising business, took off pretty quickly. Now, obviously once you started to get into 97, 98, and the dotcom boom, all hell broke loose. But that's a whole different story. I mean, that changed a lot of stuff. But prior to that, when it was still a somewhat rational market, advertisers liked what we had to say, and we were growing very, very quickly, which was great. And I think the newsroom was really, at least key parts of the newsroom were really encouraged by that, because I think that people like Tom Friedman really liked the fact that all of a sudden, I was showing these guys that, hey, we have X number of readers in Saudi Arabia and in places that the Times just never reached before. And as sort of the foreign correspondents and the columnists who were really interested in writing about global issues, they really liked the web from the very earliest days. So Friedman and Nick Kristof, people like that, took to it quickly. And I think the fact that it was free allowed us to build that kind of constituency in the newsroom. And in fact, that's exactly what Arthur says in the Riptide interview. Because ultimately, while I made the recommendation to take the website out for free, it was Arthur who had to approve it and get behind it. And I think his view is that we never would have gotten the kind of newsroom buy-in we got without it. So, you can reference the Riptide interview.
Oh, definitely. We'll definitely talk about that when we end. One more bit of context. Even before you get into the madness of the dot-com era, what was the size of the team that you have in maybe 96, 97, and what is what is this? What is the size of the team? Is it 4 or 5 people? What are you looking at?
No, it was more than that.
Okay.
I remember, it's interesting given how large, the Times is now. But I mean, I remember, I think it was the second budget year, so it would have been sometime in the fall of 1996, maybe, or maybe even earlier than that. There was a guy in charge of the company who will remain nameless, and I went to him and I said, not Arthur, of course, a business guy, and I said, at some point I hope to have 40 people, and he looked at me and he said, you will never have 40 people. And so, certainly in the 96 time frame, and again, others like Rich may remember better, but I'd say something in the 25 range, maybe 20, 25. I have a champagne bottle from the night that we launched, and everybody signed it, and everybody was basically there, and I think there are probably 20 names on it, something like that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let's just briefly talk about how in the dot-com era, later in the 90s, there is a movement to spin off your team, the digital team, and give it its own independence, and there's even talk of an IPO, which doesn't actually ever happen. When that starts to happen, are you then given the more resources? Are you then given the independence and the engineers and things like that?
Well, no, not initially. I mean, what happened is that it became apparent at a certain point in time. A couple of things became apparent. One is that, particularly then, that this web thing was probably more serious than people had initially thought. It was very, very difficult to keep people, particularly technical people, because they were going to companies for stock options, and we couldn't provide that. But I think also the CEO of the company at the time, a guy named Russ Lewis, had read Clay Christensen's book, The Innovator's Dilemma, and I think he thought two things at that point. And I don't want to put words in his mouth, but my recollection is that he thought two things. One, he thought that without getting independence for us, we would be forever trapped under the foot of the big New York Times. And The Innovator's Dilemma essentially outlines why that takes place. It's not because people are stupid or even have wrong ideas. It's because the current model is so much better financially than the new one, and so every fiber in a business person's being fights to keep that current model going. So he wanted to create a separate business in order to really let us do what we needed to do to compete in the marketplace. So that was rationale number one. But rationale number two is he knew it was going to cost money to do that. And I don't think he wanted to pay for it all himself. He wanted to use the kind of irrational exuberance in the marketplace to have the public pay for some of it. And that wasn't a new idea. I mean, Barnes & Noble had already gone out with dotcom, and ZD had gone out with ZDNet. And those CEOs, the CEOs of those businesses were sort of my comps. In other words, in terms of how much stock I was going to get and how much I was going to get paid and stuff like that. So there were others out there. Disney had done it, I think, with Starwave, who had already gone out. So we hired Goldman Sachs, and we decided to do it with a tracking stock, and we were rehearsing the roadshow in April of 2000 when the market crashed, and the bankers went away and never came back. So that ended, but we remained an independent division for 5 more years, and there were very intense debates in the company at that time, and it got personal. I mean, people were very upset that we were being cut loose from the mothership, I can understand that. It was a loss of control. It was in a sense, I think people were feeling like, well, why should this group of people kind of be sort of own the future when when we're working so hard to make all the money? And I mean, it was perfectly understandable human behavior.
A couple of things from your Digital Riptide interview that I wanted to hit on real quick, both around the dotcom bubble busting, what you call the winter, what I call the nuclear winter. But one of the first things you say, you mentioned sort of offhandedly that, and I remember this too, that there was sort of a sense from old media, old business, whatever, in 2001-ish, that there was like relief that, okay, we're glad this fad is over. You know what I mean? But
there was that.
Go ahead.
There was that. I mean, you said it. I don't.
Okay.
There was a sense, I think, from a lot of quarters that that it was just a fad, like you say, and at that point, what I remember, and again, we were still an independent division, and we had, just because we were independent didn't mean that we didn't have really good connections back to the New York Times. And even today, one of my best friends from the company was running corporate development back then, and the two of us started to look at at some of the companies that were out there and say sort of, hey, if we could get CNET for $250 million, isn't that a really good idea?
Mm-hmm.
But the only person, I mean, to be fair to Russ, who didn't want to do it at the time, and I think he would have been crucified by the street had he done it, I mean, the only person who was doing it at that point was Barry Diller. Everybody else was running for the hills, and Barry picked up TripAdvisor for like $60 million.
Right, and Match and all those other things.
Match, yeah. I mean, he just went on a buying spree, and billions of dollars later, I mean, he was probably right.
Well, part two of that then, though, again, this is something that I bang on a lot about on these episodes, is that despite the nuclear winter, it's not like people stopped using the internet. And I think you guys saw that at New York Times Online. It's not like people stopped coming to the website.
Yeah, I would draw two curves, right? I mean, one curve was the NASDAQ market, which looked like an electrocardiogram, sort of up and down. And then the other one was this kind of linear growth curve that the nytimes.com was. So you could basically draw the Times curve straight through that electrocardiogram, and you wouldn't think that there was anything going on other than just more and more and more growth. The consumer never missed a beat. Not for a single month. In fact, some of our biggest, and look, it's the news business, so you can expect this sort of thing. But September 11th, 2001 was obviously, a lot of usage that day, right? I mean, that was in a sense a day when the web, because the thing happened early in the morning, right? This terrible tragedy took place
after the newspapers get delivered, right?
On the East Coast. So the papers were already, the papers didn't have anything. So everything was happening on television and on the internet. And, we went up with a kind of a graphics-free, because it was being so heavily loaded that we had to really skinny it down. And it was a huge day, right, in terms of usage. And, similarly, other news events would drive that kind of usage. And that has nothing to do with, the NASDAQ price of Yahoo or any other internet company. So it just, the consumer was always, the best indicator of the strength of the business.
We'll end with bringing the story into the modern era, as it were. But I do want to make one more point that occurred to me when I was listening to the Digital Riptide interviews, where you guys talk about, and I will link to your interview there, so people will be able to check this out. You guys do talk about the decision to go free. We're going to come back to that for a second. And I just wanted to comment and see what you think of this, that you guys come to the conclusion that it's sort of inevitable, or you come to that conclusion. And I wanted to point out that, when we've looked at e-commerce and things like that, e-commerce was slow to gain adoption because, again, early on, people didn't trust their credit cards online. Like, actually, e-commerce, if you look at the numbers, has a slow growth trajectory that doesn't really start to take off till 98. So when you launch in 96, it's not like you could have done pay. But then the other thing that I wanted to point out is that, remember, the culture of the web at the time, 95, 96, it really grows out of that shareware, freeware era. It's a little hippie. And, I spoke with Tim Brady, employee number 3 at Yahoo. Even when they turned on ads at Yahoo, they were completely afraid that they had put a dagger in their audience, much less they knew they could never ask their audience to pay. So I don't think that at that time you could have ever asked people to pay for anything on the web, much less content, much less news. Just let me know what you think about that.
I think that's wrong. I think I have a very different view.
Okay.
I mean, obviously there were significant hurdles, and you've mentioned them. Okay, but the biggest hurdle, in my view, I mean, if you trace my career all the way back to when I was a 24-year-old at working on the WETA trial. I mean, my love is product. I mean, I focused intently on that and the consumer. And I just didn't think we had a good enough product to charge for. The fact that it was the journalism of the New York Times was totally beside the point, in my opinion. It was just not robust enough, regardless of the journalism. The user experience was not robust enough to demand payment for. And I felt that we needed to build an audience first, and in order to do that, at that time with that product, it needed to be free. It's that simple. The Wall Street Journal, let's be clear. AOL had been charging, now it was charging a kind of bundled ISP, it was an ISP in addition to being a service, but AOL had been charging from, the mid-'80s. The teletext and videotext guys were charging, and the Wall Street Journal was charging. The Wall Street Journal had a proprietary, not site, but a proprietary service up with AT&T, Interchange, prior to its website. But then when its website went up, it was charging. I just felt like the Times brand needed to stretch its wings on the web, and it could only do that by being free for a period of time. And the criticism of that has always been that, you kind of set in motion this journalism should be free thing, but I didn't set that in motion. In fact, that was in motion when we launched the Times at the time. I mean, every other website except for WSJ was free, and every other general news website, I should say. And at that time, this is the pre-Murdoch Wall Street Journal, the Journal was a business-to-business product. It was not a general news product like it is today. It was pure B2B. And so, I felt at the time that CNN and Yahoo News, even though the journalism clearly isn't as strong as the New York Times journalism, was delivering a much superior user experience because they were current, because they understood breaking news, and they understood that narrowband services required, somewhat different sensibility in terms of article length and graphical usage and stuff like that. So I think we did the right thing in hindsight, and the Journal probably did the right thing for its business.
But in essence, what you're saying is that you didn't feel at the time that you could essentially charge for what was a beta product.
That's right.
Yeah. So again, I'm going to reference the Digital Riptide interview, which I'll link to again. To bring it up to the modern era, you mentioned that the Times has been very good at always trying out a lot of things and a lot of different strategies. And into this decade, we're now not in a paywall model, but in like this metered paywall model. And just this year, the Times announced that it had reached 1 million digital subscribers, I think in August. And actually, even today, there was a Nieman Lab article that talks about the new this year's New York Times digital strategy memo, that it says, it has a tone of confidence, of what it called budding confidence or whatever. So I'm not going to ask you to prognosticate about like what the health of the Times and its online strategy and all that stuff is, but I just wanted to get a sense of, do you still feel like the Times is still a willing to experiment and willing to go in all sorts of directions to find out what works?
Well, I think the Times is committed to being a great journalistic institution, and as Dean Baquet said recently, to having more reporters, out there than anyone else. That's its business. And again, if you listen to Arthur's interview, the thing I ask him at the end is, really what essentially I ask him, if people aren't willing to pay, is this is this it? And I think he basically says, yeah, I mean, we're in the quality journalism business, and that's the business we're in. I think that the Times is willing to experiment with those guardrails in mind. It's not going to go and do stuff that, unless I'm very wrong, radically move away from high quality journalism. In fact, on the contrary, I think it's over time been putting more and more and more arrows into that, behind that. And so, experiments like the type we were running back, 20 years ago, like acquiring a buzz and acquiring about.com. I mean, whatever you think of those deals, they were done to significantly go beyond the delivery of high quality journalism. And I think we're now at a time when we are, intently focused on delivering high quality journalism, and it's working. And so I don't see, any real need at this point to go outside of those rails. But so others may have a different view.
One last question, I promise. But this again references digital riptide, which we'll talk about before we end. I believe it's Eric Schmidt that talks about this idea that what maybe the news industry, the content industry, one of the big problems was that from the beginning they didn't value the engineer, the software engineer.
Correct.
Do you think that that's changing? Does the content industry value the engineer more today?
Yeah, I think that the content industry values engineering much more today. But again, within the guardrails of what the industry knows how to do and can do. Google has a much more adventuresome. It's got, let's be fair. I mean, it's got the most amazing business model, at least to date, that I think any company on earth has ever had.
I tend to agree with that. Yes, with
amazing gross margins and just, I mean, they do very, very well, as Eric says himself in the interview. And so, they have a capability of going and doing stuff that nobody else or very few others can reasonably do. But I think he's correct in saying that the innovation point in technology is engineering, and that I think is probably still to a very large extent under-leveraged by the media industries.
Well, Martin, as we've mentioned countless times, Martin is not, I believe, with the day-to-day with the New York Times anymore, but you still consult, is that right?
On occasion, yeah.
Okay, so but amongst the things that he's been doing since he left the Times is this oral history project, sort of like this one, called Riptide. The website is digitalriptide.org. I will link to it in the show notes. They have 80 plus, I think, oral history interviews that are fantastic. I highly recommend them. They focus on this intersection of the web and journalism and media and the clash of the two, the evolution of the two. It's just fantastic stuff. So I highly recommend that. And Martin, also, if there's anything else that you're involved in, what are you up to today? And is there anything that you wanna talk about?
Well, I mean, I teach. I'm a professor at Boston University. So if there are any BU students listening, you should take my course. It's called Media Disruption, and I also sit on several boards and have a number of consulting clients. But so I'm a busy guy, but I'm a fairly free agent at this point. And at this stage in my life, that's what I like. But I in a sense, as a profession, I'm now an academic, which is an interesting change.
Well, Martin Nisenholtz, thank you so much for not only remembering that, but for laying that all out for us. And it was just fascinating stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If this is the first time you're listening to this podcast, please subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. There's plenty more great internet history where that came from. And if you're a longtime listener, then you know what to do to help us out. Rate and review us on iTunes. Because iTunes gives credit to reviews and ratings, and the more great reviews we get, the more people will discover us. As always, there's more info on our website, www.internethistorypodcast.com. The show's Twitter handle is @NetHistoryPod, and my personal Twitter is @BrianMCC. Thanks for listening.